For years, Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman were seen as Hollywood's untouchable couple. No public scandals. No ugly headlines, just red carpets, award shows, and a marriage people believed had beaten the odds. But then, it ended. Quietly. No dramatic announcement. No emotional interviews, just a sudden confirmation that shocked everyone. After 19 years of marriage, one of Hollywood's most admired relationships was officially over. And what made it even more unsettling was how little anyone knew about why. Sources later claimed Nicole didn't want the separation at all. In fact, it's been said she was trying to save the marriage until the very end. That detail alone changed how fans saw the breakup. Because this wasn't two people drifting apart together. It felt one-sided. What made things stranger was the timing. By the start of summer 2025, reports suggested the couple was already living separately. No public tension. No visible cracks, just distance. The kind that grows quietly before anyone notices. And here's where the story takes a turn. While fans were still processing the idea of a divorce, insiders hinted that Keith had already emotionally moved on. Not publicly, not officially, but privately. Something had shifted. This wasn't a messy breakup filled with accusations or explosive arguments. It was colder than that, more controlled, almost calculated. Friends close to the situation described it as a relationship that had run its course. But for many, that explanation felt incomplete, because relationships like this don't just fade without leaving a mark. Nicole, known for guarding her private life fiercely, suddenly began doing something unusual, leaning into her family image more than ever. At the same time, Keith pulled away from the spotlight entirely. No statements. No clarifications. Just silence, and silence, in celebrity culture, is rarely empty. Fans began asking uncomfortable questions. Was there resentment building behind closed doors? Did fame finally pull them in opposite directions? Or was there something, or someone, else influencing the split? What's clear is this: the end of their marriage wasn't loud, but it was deeply unsettling, because when a relationship this polished ends without explanation, people don't just accept it, they start searching for clues. And those clues didn't come from interviews or press releases, they came from body language, from social media, from who stood with whom once the cameras were off. And that's where the real story begins. Because as the marriage quietly collapsed, the family line started to shift, and not everyone ended up on the same side. The shift became impossible to ignore once Keith and Nicole were no longer presenting a united front. Almost immediately, attention turned to their daughters, Sunday and Faith, and how visibly close they appeared to be with their mother. Insiders began whispering that this wasn't just normal post-divorce bonding. According to reports, the girls were publicly supporting mom, a phrase that raised eyebrows because teen daughters are often known to cling tightly to their fathers. One source went as far as to describe the dynamic as 3 against 1, suggesting that whatever happened behind closed doors left the girls emotionally aligned with Nicole. That framing alone sparked intense speculation, because kids don't take sides without a reason, especially in families that once seemed so balanced. What fueled the conversation even more was how intentional everything looked. Nicole, who has always been fiercely private about her children, suddenly began featuring them more prominently than ever. Not just casual snapshots, but moments that felt symbolic, arms linked, hands held, faces close together. To longtime fans, this felt deliberate, almost like a quiet message, the kind that doesn't need words because the visual says enough. Insiders pointed out that this us against the world body language didn't appear accidental. It looked protective, defensive, as if Nicole was closing ranks with her daughters while something else unfolded in the background. Trips to Paris and Sydney only added to the narrative. Instead of traveling solo for work, Nicole was constantly photographed with the girls by her side. Then came the Thanksgiving turkey trot photos, something she would never have shared years earlier. That small detail stood out more than people expected. Nicole has built a career on control and restraint, yet here she was offering rare access to her personal life. To some, it looked like healing. To others, it looked like damage control. And to many, it felt like a response to something they weren't being told. Meanwhile, Keith was noticeably absent from these family moments. No shared holidays, no visible presence, no public signs of rebuilding the bond. That silence made the contrast sharper. Fans began asking whether the daughters were reacting to the divorce itself, or to what followed it. Because support isn't just emotional, it's often reactive. And when teenagers move closer to one parent, it usually means they're processing more than just change. They're responding to behavior, to choices, to something that made them uncomfortable. What's important is that none of this was confirmed outright. These are interpretations, framed by sources and amplified by patterns. But patterns matter. And the pattern here suggested a family quietly reorganizing itself. Nicole at the center, the girls firmly at her side, and Keith, somewhere else entirely, which raised a far more unsettling question. If the children felt compelled to choose a side, what exactly were they reacting to? And more importantly, did it have anything to do with what Keith would do next? What made everything feel even more unusual was how dramatically Nicole Kidman's public behavior began to change after the split. For someone who spent decades drawing a hard line between her career and her children, this shift didn't go unnoticed. Suddenly, her daughters weren't just in the background, they were front and center. Not posed red carpet shots or carefully staged appearances, but candid moments that felt intentionally intimate. Nicole sharing these images felt less like coincidence and more like communication, a quiet signal that her world had narrowed, and her priorities had sharpened. People who have followed Nicole for years noticed how rare this was. She's always been selective, almost guarded, when it comes to her family life. Yet here she was, posting pictures from Paris, from Sydney, from moments that would normally remain private. The Thanksgiving turkey trot photos stood out the most. A casual running race, the kind of thing celebrities usually keep off their feeds. That detail sparked conversation because it broke her pattern. It suggested a woman leaning into normalcy at a time when her life was anything but normal. But it wasn't just the locations or frequency. It was the body language. Arms linked, hands held, faces close. There was a togetherness that felt protective, almost defiant. To many observers, it looked like Nicole was creating a visible emotional shield around her daughters. Not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle, maternal one. The message seemed clear. Whatever was happening behind the scenes, this unit was solid, unmovable. Some fans interpreted this as healing, a mother grounding herself through her children after a painful separation. Others weren't so sure. They wondered if the posts were a response to something she couldn't control, a way of reclaiming narrative without ever addressing it directly. In celebrity culture, silence is powerful, but images can speak even louder. And these images felt intentional. What added to the tension was how consistent the pattern became. It wasn't a one-off moment of vulnerability. It kept happening, trip after trip, post after post, each one reinforcing the same visual story. Nicole and the girls, together, always together. The more it continued, the harder it became to dismiss as coincidence. At the same time, Keith remained absent from these frames. No shared holidays, no joint moments, no visible overlap. That absence made Nicole's presence with the girls feel even stronger by contrast. It wasn't just about showing closeness. It was about showing stability, control, a sense of grounding when everything else felt uncertain. Still, nothing was said outright. No captions explaining emotions. No interviews clarifying intentions. Just images, and the silence around them. And in that silence, speculation grew. Because when someone who values privacy suddenly opens a window into their personal life, it usually means something has changed deeply. The question wasn't whether Nicole was being more open. The question was why. And whether this shift was simply about motherhood, or about bracing for what the public hadn't fully seen yet. While Nicole was becoming more visible with her daughters, Keith Urban was doing the opposite, disappearing into his own world. Reports placed him in Nashville, far from the family-centered image Nicole was projecting. Instead of public appearances or emotional statements, Keith reportedly threw himself into work. But this wasn't just another album cycle. Insiders claimed he was renovating a studio on Music Row, a move that signaled something deeper than routine creativity. When artists retreat like this, it's rarely just about music. It's about processing. Those close to the situation suggested Keith was channeling everything into what many are already calling a breakup album. Not a loud, angry one, but something far more uncomfortable. A reflective retelling of how a love story slowly unraveled. That detail alone changed how fans viewed his silence. Because for musicians, albums are confessions. And when someone chooses to speak through music instead of interviews, it usually means the truth is complicated. What made this even more intriguing was the timing. The studio renovations reportedly began shortly after the separation became official. Almost as if Keith knew he needed a space where he could control the narrative, away from headlines, away from speculation. Nashville has always been a place of reinvention for country artists, and Keith returning there felt symbolic. A reset, a retreat, a chance to rewrite himself outside of the marriage. Sources hinted that the upcoming project may touch on regret, distance, and emotional fatigue, themes that don't just appear out of nowhere. Fans began connecting dots. wondering if the music would quietly explain what words never did. Because when relationships collapse without public drama, the real story often leaks out in ART. At the same time, Keith's absence from family-centered moments became more noticeable. No shared holidays, no public acknowledgement of the emotional shift everyone else seemed to feel. To some, it looked like avoidance. To others, survival. The kind where someone shuts down everything except the one thing they know how to do well. There was also something unsettling about how controlled everything felt. No emotional outbursts, no defensive statements, just work, silence, distance. That restraint made fans uneasy because it suggested this wasn't a spontaneous split. It felt thought out, processed, maybe even accepted, at least on one side. And then there was the question no one could ignore. If Keith was pouring this much energy into a breakup album, what story was he preparing to tell? Because albums don't just reflect the past, they shape public memory. Whatever he releases next won't just be music. It will be his version of events, and that raised a new layer of tension. Because while Nicole was showing unity and protection, Keith was building something private, something personal, something that might finally explain what went wrong, or make it even more complicated. And just when people thought the story couldn't shift again, whispers started circulating that Keith's Nashville chapter wasn't being lived alone. That's when the narrative took a sharp turn. While fans were still focused on the divorce and the emotional fallout, reports began surfacing that Keith Urban wasn't actually alone anymore. Quietly, and without any public confirmation, insiders started suggesting he had moved on, and not in a casual way. According to multiple sources, Keith was involved with someone new, and the relationship was being described as serious. Not a rebound, not a distraction, something established enough to raise eyebrows. What really fueled the speculation was how fast everything seemed to be happening. People close to the situation claimed that Keith and this new woman might already be living together. That detail instantly shifted the tone of the conversation. Moving in isn't something people do lightly, especially after a nearly two-decade marriage. It suggested commitment, comfort, and perhaps emotional closure that others hadn't reached. At the same time, reports were careful to stress one important point. There was no suggestion of overlap, no claims of an affair, no accusations that the relationship began before the marriage ended. That distinction mattered, but it didn't stop the whispers. Because even without wrongdoing, timing alone can feel unsettling, especially when one side appears to move forward faster than the other. For fans, this raised uncomfortable questions. Had Keith emotionally checked out long before the divorce became official? Was this new relationship a cause of the split, or simply a result of it? Sources framed it as the latter, but public perception isn't always shaped by facts alone. It's shaped by patterns, and the pattern here felt abrupt. What added tension was Keith's continued silence. No denial, no confirmation, no attempt to slow the narrative. In celebrity culture, silence often speaks louder than statements, and the lack of response only made the rumors feel heavier, more believable. Observers also began linking this development to the daughter's behavior. Suddenly, the 3-against-1 framing felt less abstract. If Keith had already started building a new life, even quietly, it might explain why the family dynamics shifted so visibly. Teenagers, after all, react strongly to change, especially when it feels sudden. Still, everything remained carefully framed as speculation. Reports claim, sources suggest, no hard confirmation. But when multiple outlets start circling the same idea, it usually means something is happening behind the scenes. The most unsettling part wasn't the idea of Keith dating again. It was the speed, the sense that while one chapter was still being emotionally processed by the public, another had already begun privately, and then a name started surfacing, one that connected music, Nashville, and a much younger generation. A name that made the rumors feel suddenly specific, because once speculation gets a face, it stops being abstract. And the moment that name entered the conversation, the story took on an entirely new weight. Once a name entered the conversation, everything changed. The speculation stopped feeling vague and suddenly became very specific. Reports began circling around Carly Scott Collins, a 26-year-old country singer whose name kept popping up whenever insiders talked about Keith's new chapter. On the surface, the connection seemed logical. Same industry, same city, same creative world. Nashville has a way of pulling artists together, especially those navigating reinvention. What made people pause wasn't just who she was, it was the contrast. Carly is young, early in her career, and still building her place in the industry. Keith, on the other hand, is a global star with decades of experience and a highly public personal history. That gap instantly became part of the conversation, not as an accusation, but as a point of curiosity. Fans weren't just asking if the rumors were true, they were asking what this relationship represented. Sources were careful to frame everything responsibly. There was no suggestion of an affair, no claim that Carly had anything to do with the marriage ending. In fact, reports consistently emphasized that this connection developed after the divorce. But even with that clarification, the optics alone sparked debate. Because relationships don't exist in a vacuum, especially when one is unfolding in the shadow of a very public split. Adding to the intrigue was the silence from both sides. Representatives for Keith and Carly reportedly declined to comment. No denial, no confirmation. That absence of response only deepened speculation. In the celebrity world, silence is often a strategic choice, one that allows stories to breathe without being controlled. Fans also began revisiting Carly's rise in the country scene. Her sound, her image, her Nashville presence. Suddenly, everything felt connected. People wondered whether Keith was offering mentorship, companionship, or something more personal. Again, nothing was confirmed. But curiosity thrives in gray areas. What complicated matters further was the emotional context. Keith wasn't just dating. He was reportedly working on a deeply personal album about loss and change. Pairing that with a new relationship created a strange contrast. One foot in reflection, one foot in reinvention. That duality made the story feel layered rather than scandalous. For some, Carly symbolized a fresh start, a clean break from a long, heavy chapter. For others, she represented how quickly Keith seemed to be moving forward while the rest of the family was still visibly adjusting. Neither interpretation was proven, but both were emotionally charged, and that's what made this part of the story so powerful. It wasn't about blame, it was about timing, about perception, about how new beginnings can feel unsettling when the past hasn't fully settled, because once a new person enters the frame, the focus shifts. The divorce stops being the ending, and starts becoming the backstory. By the time the divorce was finalized earlier this month, the lines were clearly drawn. Keith Urban would have every other weekend with Sunday and Faith, while Nicole Kidman retained the majority of the year with the girls, 306 days, according to reports. The arrangement was unusual not for its logistics, but for what it implied about the family dynamic. Custody wasn't just about schedules, it reflected emotional alignments, priorities, and the aftermath of nearly 2 decades together. The deal was reportedly amicable in terms of finances as well. Both parties waived spousal and child support, a decision that signaled a desire to simplify what could have been a much messier split. But even with the legalities settled, the emotional weight remained. Teen daughters navigating such a split are rarely neutral observers, and the arrangement subtly hinted at where the children's loyalties and comfort lay. By spending most of the year with Nicole, Sunday and Faith were clearly embedded in her support system, reinforcing the 3-against-1 perception that had started making headlines earlier. For Keith, the custody setup allowed time to focus on his own life and music, yet it also underscored the distance he would have from daily parenting. Every other weekend is more than a schedule, it's a symbol of the shift from intimate family life to compartmentalized involvement. Sources noted that the girls' increasingly visible alignment with their mother, both online and in private settings, reflected the emotional reality of this arrangement. The contrast between the parents' post-divorce lives could not have been starker. Nicole, embracing her daughters publicly and showcasing a close-knit, protective family unit. Keith, retreating into Nashville, renovating his studio, and beginning work on a breakup album that might expose the private unraveling of their love story. This duality created tension not because either party was doing something wrong, but because the timing and visibility made the split feel more like a chess match than a natural evolution. Observers also speculated on what this custody arrangement meant for the public perception of the family. In celebrity culture, who is seen with the children often shapes the narrative of good parenting, and Nicole's visibility alongside the girls strengthened her image as the anchor of stability. Meanwhile, Keith's physical absence, combined with a rumored new relationship, introduced curiosity, questions, and even criticism from fans who interpreted actions faster than explanations could arrive. Ultimately, the custody deal revealed the delicate balance of moving forward while maintaining family ties. It highlighted that a divorce isn't just about ending a marriage, but about re-establishing roles, boundaries, and emotional safety. Nicole's majority custody and Keith's limited weekends framed a story of emotional recalibration, a public indication of private realignment. And as the public watches, the tension is not over. With Keith working on an intimate album, exploring new love, and Nicole solidifying her bond with the children, the final chapter hasn't been written. The question remains, when the music plays, and the photos stop telling the story, what will truly define the legacy of this nearly two-decade partnership?